So today is a very exciting day for both me and the channel. First, for the channel, we are starting a new series, I guess you should say, basically going over the customer builds that I occasionally have to do for my customers, which should be kind of entertaining. I can kind of go through the process of how we got to the part selection and putting it together and all that fun stuff. You'll also get a little bit of an insight into how I guess, deal or work with my customers to help provide them with computers they need. And then also it's very exciting for me because I get to throw together pretty cool builds, especially with this 6700 XT that I picked up. So that's going to be super neat. Also, this is the first build that I've done in quite some time using all new parts, which is, it's been quite a while. But we'll go over a bunch of different stuff, what parts we're going to be using and the whole build process, and then showing it at the end. And throughout all of it, I'll talk a little bit about the customer and what he needed and what he wanted and how we got to that point. But without further ado, let's I guess kick into it. If I don't mention any parts specifically, you can find a full breakdown of all the parts for this build in the description below. So the first challenge that I had to overcome to get this build up and running is the ASRock B450M that we're going with was not up to date with the BIOS, so our Ryzen 5 5600X was not compatible with it quite yet. So I had to find an older Ryzen chip to update the BIOS and make sure that we could use the CPU that we have for this build. So having to assemble the computer outside of the case to update the BIOS isn't the end of the world, because I usually do this anyway to ensure that all of the parts that I have are booting and working properly and getting into Windows and whatnot before I do any building inside of the case, and that way if I get to the fully assembled product and I run into issues, I'm not troubleshooting them when the case is all assembled and things are hard to get to. So basically at this point, I'm just putting the parts together, running a few simple tests to make sure everything's working properly, and then I will get into actually building into the case. This is when I first noticed that the ASRock RX 6700 XT that we ordered for this build was performing kind of oddly. It was sticking at 500 megahertz for its clock speed, which is very well below around 2500 megahertz clock speed that the 6700 XT should be hitting. And I thought potentially maybe I ended up with a faulty card, which would be extremely obnoxious considering that getting your hands on a card like this right now is fairly difficult. But I assumed that since everything else was functioning fine, this could just be a driver issue or the Windows installation that I had on my test SSD. So I kind of let it be for now, and I'll double check that later. But it was still, putting out a display, the fans were spinning, everything was functioning normally. So I just summed it up to a driver issue and moved on with the build. Little did I know that this was going to become a rather obnoxious problem. So, letting the graphics card problem lie in wait to come and bite us in the ass later, I then move on to make sure that all the other parts are working as intended, and now that we have all of our parts checked off the list, we have to start prepping the case for putting all the components in. I ended up going with the Corsair 4000D, which actually was a really solid case to build in, and I would highly recommend it, if it fits in your budget of course. But now we have the fun task of taking out the pre-installed fans and then screwing in the abundant of RGB fans that I chose for this build. So my wrist is now going to hurt for the next 3 days as I screw in all of these spectacular light up fans. So skipping over the absolute pleasant experience that was screwing in all the fans and mounting in that front radiator, it is now time to slap in the motherboard into the case and start actually getting a computer assembled. So my process is always putting the motherboard in, wiring up all the different I/O cables and fan cables that you may have, then putting in your power supply and routing any sort of power supply cables you may have, and then putting in things like your graphics cards, external hard drives, and things of that nature. And that's generally how I do my layers of installing and cable management and all that fun stuff. So finally, you're left with every PC builder's dream / nightmare, which is pressing the power button and seeing if all of your hard work ultimately paid off. So after pressing the power button and seeing the default green light splashed across my face, I lay in wait to see if a post will actually pop up on my screen, which lo and behold, the Two Wheels Used Tech Dreamboat is still chugging along as another successful post is in the books. So without further ado, let me introduce to you the build Snowtrooper. So now that the computer is fully assembled, I have to start the fun process of making sure that everything behaves as it should. This is the time that I have to deal with that funky graphics card problem I mentioned earlier, where it was clocking up to 500 megahertz and then stopping. So I'll try and condense the story a little bit, but it's a tad more interesting than your normal troubleshooting, so I thought I would include it. So I reached out to ASRock customer support, as anyone should in this situation, because I had done my own troubleshooting, basically checking drivers, trying it in a different system, trying a fresh Windows install, trying older drivers, trying to eliminate power limits that may in place, all the stuff that might potentially be the problem. And after doing a bunch of troubleshooting, I reached out and said, hey, here's what I've done, here's what I've tried, here's the problem. I got back, check your drivers, there's nothing wrong with the card. Obviously, I wasn't too pleased with that response, so I sent back another email basically stating, I've tried all this, I've tried the drivers, I've dug around online, and it appears that this might be a VBIOS issue since other RX 6700 XT cards are having the same exact 500 megahertz issues and it's fixed by a new VBIOS. I thought maybe that might point us in the right direction, to which I got a response, please refund the card, there's nothing we can do to help you. Which I think is kind of an insulting solution, because this is quote-unquote technical support for ASRock, and for them to give absolutely no technical support and just tell me to refund it, especially during our GPU crisis, where it's very clear that I'm not going to be able to get my hands on another card like this very easily, I found it very obnoxious that was their second solution without dealing with any sort of troubleshooting at all. So I sent them back another email, saying that that was not a solution that I was going to take and that I wanted to solve the problem. I was in a Reddit forum thread that a lot of other people were having this similar problem with the exact same card. We all reached out to customer support together, and lo and behold, we got an updated VBIOS which fixed the issue. So, a very long walk for a short drink of water, having to harass ASRock customer support to death for about 4 days in a row, and finally getting the solution to fix the card. So now we can actually test the computer, make sure it's all hunky-dory, and then get it sent off to our customer. So after making sure the computer was good to go and handing it off to my customer, here it lies in its new home at his gaming setup. Hopefully you understand why it's called the Stormtrooper after seeing this image, but I quite like the little setup he has going, and I think it complements the computer quite nice. But that basically wraps up the little story about this customer in particular and the computer I built for him. So if you liked the video or learned something new, hit that like button. If you thought this was a waste of your time, hit that dislike button. If you want to see more customer builds, flipping advice, or anything of that nature, hit that subscribe button. I will try my best to keep you around. And I guess I should also plug my Discord server. Link will be down in the description if you're interested in joining. It's a bunch of nerds complaining about graphics card prices currently. But without further ado, have a good day, guys.